The candles in the foyer of the King's Theatre numbered 412. Phoebe Langton, Duchess of Strathmore, had counted them once during a performance of Cassie Fan Tout that had failed to hold her attention, and the number had lodged in her memory the way useless things sometimes do, permanently and without apology. She thought of them now as she adjusted her gloves in the mirror of the Strathmore box, because the alternative was to think about the woman she had just seen crossing the foyer below, and she was not yet ready to think about that. "The second act begins in 10 minutes, her husband said from behind her, not looking up from the program he had been studying with the focus of a man pretending to read. "Yes," Phoebe said. "I thought I might stretch my legs." Miles did not reply. He rarely did when she announced small intentions, a walk, a visit to the retiring room, a desire for lemonade. These were beneath the threshold of his attention, which was reserved for matters of the estate, the House of Lords, and, she supposed, whatever occupied his Tuesdays and Thursdays between 4 and 7:30, when he was never at home and never explained where he had been. She had married Miles Langton in the April of 1814, when the daffodils along the south lawn of Strathmore Park had been so thick they looked like a second sun had fallen and shattered across the ground. She had been 20, the eldest daughter of Josiah Linford, whose fortune in imported silks had purchased her a place at the edge of the Tun, but never quite inside it. Her father had been blunt about the arrangement. The Duke required capital. Mr. Linford required a title for his daughter. It was a transaction dressed in orange blossom, and both men had signed it with the satisfied air of men who believed they had got the better end. Phoebe had not minded at first. She had not expected love. Her father had never traded in commodities he could not weigh, and Miles had been courteous in the way that men of rank learn to be courteous, which is to say he opened doors and remembered her name and did not raise his voice. These were not small things in her estimation. Her mother had died when she was 14, and her father's house had been efficient, prosperous, and entirely without warmth. Strathmore Park, with its long corridors and its silence, had felt familiar. What she had not anticipated was the particular quality of Miles's indifference. It was not cold, it was not unkind, it was simply complete. He looked at her across the breakfast table each morning the way one looks at a clock, confirming the time, then moving on. He asked after her health with the same inflection he used to ask Polton about the drainage ditches in the west pasture. She was a fact of his household, no more remarkable than the mahogany sideboard or the Turner watercolor above the fireplace that he had inherited from his uncle and never once admired. She had learned of Lady Sabine Avebury in the October of that year, not through whispered gossip or a discovered letter, but through the simple arithmetic of household accounts. Mrs. Trask, the housekeeper, had presented the quarterly ledger with her customary thoroughness, and there, between the chandler's bill and the farrier's invoice, was an entry for flowers, roses specifically, sent weekly to an address in Half Moon Street that Phoebe did not recognize. She had asked Mrs. Trask about it in the same tone she might have used to query a discrepancy in the butcher's charges. Mrs. Trask's face had told her everything. The housekeeper's mouth had opened, closed, opened again, and then settled into an expression of such careful neutrality that it answered every question Phoebe had not yet thought to ask. "I see," Phoebe had said, and she had meant it. She saw it clearly, the shape of her marriage, its dimensions and its boundaries, mapped as precisely as the surveyor's drawings her father kept in his offices on Cheapside. She saw the Tuesdays and the Thursdays. She saw the bunch of roses 52 times a year, charged to the household accounts with the blithe certainty of a man who had never imagined his wife would read a ledger. She saw all of it, and she said nothing more about it, not to Mrs. Trask, not to Miles, not to anyone. What she did instead was this: she became very good at being the Duchess of Strathmore. It had taken time. The Tun had watched her from the beginning, with the particular attention that society reserves for interlopers, not hostile precisely, but measuring, the way a jeweler examines a stone for flaws before declaring it paste. She was Linford's daughter. Her grandfather had been a wool merchant in Leeds. These facts preceded her into every room like footmen announcing a guest no one had invited, and for the first 2 seasons she had felt their weight in every conversation that died a beat too soon, every invitation that arrived a day too late. She had not fought it. She had not charmed her way through it. She had simply continued, attending, contributing, being present with such steady, unyielding competence that the Tun eventually forgot to question her right to be there, the way one forgets to question the foundation of a building that has simply refused to fall down. She oversaw the Strathmore estates through Polton with a precision that startled even the steward, who had served 3 dukes before her. She managed the household accounts, all of them, including the Roses. She dressed impeccably, spoke correctly, curtsied at the proper depth, and never once committed the unforgivable sin of appearing to try too hard. By their second winter, Lady Ashwick had pronounced her adequate. By their third, the Countess of Dorsham had called her surprisingly capable. These were not compliments exactly, but they were concessions, extracted through the slow accumulation of evidence. Phoebe collected them the way her father collected shipping receipts, proof that the goods had arrived intact. And through all of it, Lady Sabine Avebury moved in the same circles like a shadow cast by a sun that Phoebe was not permitted to acknowledge. She was beautiful, of course, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with the kind of angular elegance that portrait painters adored and other women found exhausting. She was the widow of Sir Philip Avebury, whose gambling debts had left her with a title, a house in Half Moon Street, and very little else. She was, Phoebe understood, everything that Phoebe was not, born to this world, fluent in its language, occupying it with the ease of a woman who had never had to earn her place in a room. They had never spoken. In 3 years of attending the same balls, the same dinners, the same charity concerts and afternoon calls, they had never once exchanged a word. This was not accident. It was architecture, the careful, invisible engineering of a society that knew precisely how to seat 2 women at the same table without requiring them to acknowledge each other's existence. Phoebe had cooperated with this arrangement. She had looked through Lady Sabine the way one looks through a window, seeing what lay beyond, never the glass itself. Tonight, the glass had cracked. She had seen Lady Sabine in the foyer below as the Strathmore party arrived, standing near the foot of the staircase with Lord and Lady Pembury, wearing a gown of deep burgundy silk that caught the candlelight in a way that made several heads turn. Miles had seen her too. Phoebe had watched his eyes find her and hold for a fraction of a second, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but Phoebe noticed everything, always had, and the fraction of a second told her all she needed to know about the state of the Roses in Half Moon Street. Now the interval had come, and Phoebe adjusted her gloves and thought about the 412 candles and made a decision that she had not known she was going to make until she was already making it. She descended the staircase alone. The marble was cool beneath the thin soles of her evening slippers, and the banister, gilded, slightly worn where 1,000 gloved hands had gripped it, steadied her as she moved downward into the heat and noise of the interval crowd. The foyer smelled of beeswax and perfume and the faint mineral scent of the gas lamps that had been installed the previous season along the outer corridors, though the main hall still relied on candles, 412 of them, burning with the extravagant indifference of an institution that measured its worth in centuries, not shillings. The foyer of the King's Theatre during an interval was a particular kind of theatre in itself, every gesture observed, every greeting calibrated, every position in the room a statement of rank and alliance. Phoebe moved through it with the unhurried certainty she had spent 3 years perfecting, acknowledging nods from the Countess of Dorsham, exchanging 3 words with Lady Ashwick about the soprano's vibrato, accepting a glass of lemonade from a footman, and holding it without drinking. Her pulse was steady. She noted this with a kind of clinical interest, the way a physician might note the absence of a symptom. She had expected nerves, and there were none, and she understood that their absence meant she had already decided what she was going to do, even if the decision had not yet reached the part of her mind that put things into words. She saw Lady Sabine before Lady Sabine saw her. The older woman was standing near the pillar by the east corridor, half turned toward Lord Pembury, laughing at something with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her life making powerful men feel clever. Her burgundy gown pooled against the marble floor. A garnet necklace sat at her throat. Not rubies, Phoebe noted, because Sir Philip's debts had taken the rubies, and what remained was handsome but not extraordinary. The distinction mattered. Phoebe's father had taught her to read quality at a glance, and she had never unlearned it. Lady Sabine turned. Their eyes met. The distance between them was perhaps 12 feet, close enough to speak, too close to pretend she had not seen. The foyer's ambient murmur continued, but Phoebe was aware, with the peripheral attention that 3 years of social survival had sharpened to a blade, that several people nearby had noticed the geometry of the moment. Lady Ashwick, the Countess of Dorsham, Mrs. Hartington Bell, who could be relied upon to report the contents of any room to every other room in London by noon the following day. Phoebe set down her lemonade on the tray of a passing footman. She smoothed the front of her gown, pale gold silk, cut in the high empire fashion, with seed pearls along the bodice that her father had sourced from his own suppliers, because he had not trusted the London modiste to know the difference between luster and polish. She took 2 steps forward, and then she curtsied. It was not a deep curtsy, not the full court obeisance one offered to royalty with its controlled descent and its carefully angled head. It was a social curtsy, measured and precise, exactly the depth that a duchess would offer to a woman of lower rank at a public gathering. It was technically impeccable. It was utterly correct. And it was devastating. Because in executing it, Phoebe had done something that no one in that foyer had ever seen done, and that Lady Sabine had certainly never anticipated. She had acknowledged her. She had not cut her, which would have been expected and forgivable. She had not ignored her, which would have been prudent and unremarkable. She had curtsied to her. The Duchess of Strathmore, whose rank required no such gesture, had offered a curtsy to the widow of a baronet with a house in Half Moon Street and a connection to the Duke that everyone knew about, and no one was permitted to mention. The foyer went quiet. Not silent. The chandeliers still hummed with the heat of their candles, and somewhere near the staircase a footman was collecting empty glasses, but the particular weighted quiet of a room in which every person has simultaneously stopped pretending not to watch. Lady Sabine stood perfectly still. Her face, which Phoebe observed with the detached precision of a woman reading a ledger, passed through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, the beginning of a social smile that found nowhere to land, before settling into something that Phoebe could only describe as comprehension. Lady Sabine understood what had happened. She understood that the curtsy was not deference. It was declaration. The Duchess of Strathmore had made the hierarchy visible without raising her voice, without delivering a cut, without committing a single act that could be criticized or reported as anything other than perfect manners. And Lady Sabine could not respond. That was the architecture of the moment, and Phoebe had built it with the same precision with which her father built shipping contracts. Lady Sabine could not curtsy back. The Duchess outranked her, and a return curtsy would only deepen the visible gulf between their stations. She could not offer a greeting. Phoebe had already turned the encounter into a gesture of noblesse oblige, and any words would read as gratitude for condescension. She could not turn away. Half the foyer was watching. She was, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, entirely without recourse. "Lady Avebury," Phoebe said, with the gentle warmth of a woman welcoming a distant acquaintance, "I do hope you are enjoying the performance." Yes," Lady Sabine said. "Thank you, Your Grace." "The soprano is rather fine, I think," Phoebe said, "though I confess I find Italian opera rewards patience more than passion. One must sit with it." She smiled, a real smile, neither cold nor pointed, and therefore far more unsettling than either would have been. "Do enjoy the second act." She turned and walked back toward the staircase without haste, collecting her lemonade from another passing footman as she went, and climbed the stairs to the Strathmore box with the steady, measured tread of a woman who had nowhere else to be and no reason to hurry. Behind her, the foyer reconstituted itself slowly, the way a pond settles after a stone has been dropped into it, the ripples moving outward in concentric rings, each one carrying the event a little further from the point of impact. Lady Ashwick turned to the Countess of Dorsham and said something behind her fan that made the Countess close her eyes briefly, as though she had just been told something she had always suspected but had never expected to see confirmed in public. Mrs. Hartington Bell excused herself from her party and moved toward the east corridor with the purposeful air of a woman who had just been given the finest piece of intelligence she would possess all season and intended to distribute it before its value diminished. Lord Pembury looked at Lady Sabine, then at the staircase where the Duchess had disappeared, then at the floor, and said nothing at all. Lady Sabine remained by the pillar. She had not moved. The garnet necklace at her throat caught the light as she breathed, and for a moment she looked not diminished but suspended, a woman caught between the person she had been when she entered the foyer and the person she had become in the space of a single curtsy. Then someone called Lord Pembury's name from across the room, and the spell broke, and Lady Sabine turned and walked toward the ladies' retiring room with a pace that was not quite hurried, but was certainly no longer leisurely, and the foyer resumed its murmur as though nothing had happened, which was how the Ton always handled the things that mattered most. Miles was standing when she entered. He was not looking at the program. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not in 3 years of breakfasts and dinners and long, silent evenings in which the clock above the drawing-room mantelpiece had ticked so loudly she sometimes thought it was the only voice in the house that had anything to say. "Phoebe," he said. She sat down. "The second act is about to begin. What did you just do?" "I greeted an acquaintance," she said, arranging her skirts. "It would have been rude not to." He stared at her. She met his gaze with the same steady, unmoved composure with which she had descended the staircase, offered the curtsy, spoken the words, and climbed back up, the composure that was not coldness, not indifference, not anger, but something far more formidable, which was the absolute certainty of a woman who knows exactly where she stands. The orchestra began tuning. The house lights dimmed. Miles sat down beside her, and for the first time in their marriage, the silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything he had not said, everything she had not demanded, everything that 412 candles had illuminated in a single perfect gesture. They did not speak during the second act. Phoebe watched the opera. Miles watched Phoebe. When the carriage came, he offered her his hand on the steps, not the automatic gesture of a man performing a duty, but the deliberate reach of a man who was, perhaps for the first time, unsure whether the hand would be accepted. Phoebe took it. She always took it. She had never once refused him anything, and the consistency of that fact landed on Miles Langton in the darkened carriage like a stone dropped from a great height, because he understood suddenly that she had never refused, because she had never needed to. She had never begged, never wept, never demanded. She had simply been there, constant, capable, and so thoroughly underestimated that he had written her off the way one writes off a sound investment, noting the returns without ever examining the asset. "I should like to say something," he said as the carriage turned onto Haymarket. "Then say it." "The flowers," he began and stopped. He had not expected to mention the flowers. He had not planned any of this. He was a man who planned everything, who drafted his speeches for the House of Lords 3 times before delivering them, and now he was sitting in a rattling carriage with his wife, and he could not find a single sentence that was equal to what she had done in that foyer. "The roses," Phoebe said quietly. 52 deliveries a year, charged to the household account under sundry florals. He looked at her. "I've always read the household ledgers, Miles. My father taught me to read a ledger before he taught me to read a novel. I have known since October of our first year." The carriage wheels found a rut in the road and jolted them both. Miles pressed his hands together in his lap, and Phoebe saw that they were not entirely steady. "You have known," he repeated. "Yes." "And you said nothing. What would you have had me say?" She turned to him, and in the passing light from a street lamp he saw her face clearly, not angry, not wounded, not triumphant, but simply present, the way she had always been present, and he had simply never looked. "I could have wept. I could have raged. I could have written to my father and asked him to renegotiate the terms. None of those things would have changed what you did. They would only have changed what I became." He was quiet for a long time. The carriage passed St. James's and turned north. "I'm going to end it," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her sharply. "You know? You would not be sitting here saying so if you were not already certain. You are not a man who announces intentions, Miles. You announce decisions. I have always known the difference." The roses stopped the following week. No letter was written, no dramatic confrontation staged. The account entry simply ceased to appear in the household ledger, and Mrs. Trask, who had carried the knowledge of it like a splinter beneath her nail for 3 years, removed the standing order from the florist's book and said nothing to anyone, because Mrs. Trask understood that some things are best honored by their quiet disappearance. What Miles did, he did alone. He rode to Half Moon Street on a Tuesday afternoon, the last Tuesday he would ever spend there, and sat in the drawing-room where the roses had always stood in a blue Delft vase on the table by the window, and told Lady Sabine that it was finished. He did not blame Phoebe. He did not describe the curtsy. He simply said that he had made a decision, and Lady Sabine, who had survived her husband's debts and her own reduced circumstances and the particular cruelty of a society that tolerated a mistress only as long as the wife cooperated in her own invisibility, looked at him with an expression that was neither surprised nor wounded, but merely resigned, the way a woman looks when a debt she always knew was unsecured is finally called in. "She is cleverer than either of us," Lady Sabine said. Miles did not answer, because the answer was yes, and because admitting it aloud would have meant admitting that he had known it for some time, perhaps always, and had simply chosen not to reckon with it. He left Half Moon Street and did not return. The Delft vase remained on the table by the window for several weeks afterward, empty, before Lady Sabine's maid removed it to a cupboard where it would not catch the light. Lady Sabine Avebury attended 2 more events that season. At the first, a supper at the Countess of Dorsham's, she sat at the far end of the table and spoke only to Lord Pembury, who was seated beside her by a hostess who had rearranged the cards 3 times before settling on a configuration that satisfied propriety without inviting scrutiny. The conversation around her had a different quality now, not hostile, not even cold, but calibrated, the way people speak in the presence of someone whose standing has been publicly redefined and who has not yet acknowledged the redefinition. At the second, a garden party at Richmond, she arrived late and left early, and Mrs. Hartington Bell reported to 4 drawing rooms the following afternoon that Lady Avebury had looked quite diminished, really, as though she had mislaid something and could not decide whether to search for it or pretend it had never existed. The story of the curtsy had by then acquired the particular momentum that only the best pieces of social intelligence achieve, retold not as gossip, which is cheap and fades, but as anecdote, which is durable and accrues interest. The details shifted with each retelling. The gold of Phoebe's gown grew more luminous, the silence of the foyer grew more absolute, the depth of the curtsy grew more precise. But the essential fact remained unchanged in every version, because it was the kind of fact that resists embellishment. The Duchess of Strathmore, the merchant's daughter from Leeds, had offered a curtsy to her husband's mistress, and in doing so had demonstrated a command of rank so complete that even the women who had spent 2 seasons calling her adequate were forced to concede that she was, in fact, magnificent. By autumn, Lady Sabine had removed to Bath. The house in Half Moon Street was let to a naval captain's widow, and the burgundy gown was not seen again in any London drawing room. Phoebe did not celebrate. She did not gloat. She continued, as she had always continued, managing the estate through Polton with the meticulous care that had kept the Strathmore rents consistent through 2 difficult harvests, overseeing the household accounts that no longer contained any entries she could not explain, attending the events of the season with the same quiet, immovable competence that had turned society's grudging tolerance into something closer to respect. What changed was Miles. It began with small things, so small that Phoebe did not notice them immediately, because she had trained herself not to expect anything from her husband's attention, and therefore did not recognize it when it arrived. He began taking breakfast with her rather than in his study. He asked one morning whether she preferred the China tea or the Assam, and when she said Assam, he remembered it the following day, and the day after that, and the day after that, until Mrs. Trask simply stopped laying both pots and set out the Assam alone. He asked about the drainage project in the West Pasture, not the way he asked Polton as a man consulting his steward, but the way he might ask a partner, waiting for her answer with the genuine interest of a man who understood that she would know things he did not. She told him about the clay substrate that was redirecting the runoff and the modification she had proposed to the sluice gate, and he listened with his chin resting on his hand and his eyes on her face. And when she finished, he said, "That is a better solution than Polton's," and she felt something shift in the architecture of their breakfast table that had not shifted in 3 years. He began accompanying her to the village. He attended Sunday services beside her, which he had not done since their first month, and Mrs. Cathcart, the vicar's wife, remarked to no one in particular that the Duke seemed rather more present this season, which was the closest Mrs. Cathcart ever came to commentary on the private lives of her betters. One evening in November, as the fire settled in the drawing-room grate and the clock ticked its familiar percussion above the mantelpiece, Miles set down his book and said, "You never asked me to stop." Phoebe looked up from her embroidery. She was working a pattern of ivy along the edge of a cushion cover, green silk thread against cream linen, each stitch placed with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything. She had learned embroidery from her mother in the brief years before the consumption had taken her, and it was the one domestic art she practiced not because it was expected of a duchess, but because the rhythm of the needle calmed something in her that nothing else quite reached. "No," she said. "Why not?" She set the needle into the fabric and rested her hands in her lap. Outside, a November wind pressed against the windows with the particular insistence of English weather, rattling the casements in a way that Polton had promised to address, and that Phoebe had already arranged to have repaired by the estate carpenter the following week. The candles on the side table, there were 4, she had counted, guttered and steadied. She considered the question with the same care she brought to everything, weighing it, turning it, examining it for the thing that was actually being asked beneath the words. Miles was watching her with an attention that would have felt foreign 6 months ago, but that she had grown accustomed to over the autumn, the way one grows accustomed to sunlight after a long gray season, not trusting it entirely, but no longer flinching from it. "Because I wanted you to see it yourself," she said. "If I had demanded it, you would have complied. You are a decent man, Miles, and you would have done the decent thing. But compliance is not recognition. I did not want your compliance. I wanted you to look at me and see what you had." He was quiet for a very long time. The fire popped. The clock ticked. Outside, a November wind pressed against the windows with the particular insistence of English weather, and the candles on the side table, there were 4, she had counted, guttered and steadied. "I see it now," he said. "I know," she said. "You have been seeing it for weeks. I have been watching you see it." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not carried so much weight. "You watch everything. My father always said that the person who counts the inventory is the person who owns the warehouse." She returned to her embroidery, setting a stitch with the precise, unhurried hand of a woman who had learned that patience is not passivity, but a kind of power so quiet that most people mistake it for absence. "I've always counted, Miles. Everything, including you." That winter, for the first time, the Strathmore Christmas dinner included both families. Mr. Josiah Linford traveled from London with his younger daughter, and the Dowager Lady Langton came down from the Dower House, and the 2 families sat at the same table in the great dining room and ate roast goose and drank claret, and if the Dowager found Mr. Linford's table manners somewhat vigorous. She kept her observations to herself, because her son had asked her to, and because the Duchess had placed her at the head of the table with a deference so natural and so precisely calibrated that even the Dowager could not find fault with it. Phoebe watched Miles carve the goose. He did it well. He did most physical things well, with the easy competence of a man who had been taught to ride and shoot and manage an estate, and she had always noticed this about him, even when noticing was all she had. But tonight he looked up between servings and caught her eye across the table and held it, and the look he gave her was not the glance of a man confirming the time on a clock. Her father noticed too. Josiah Linford had built his fortune on the ability to read a room, to see the quality in a bolt of silk before the merchant had finished unrolling it, to judge a man's creditworthiness from the state of his cuffs and the steadiness of his handshake. He watched his son-in-law watching his daughter, and he set down his wineglass with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has just discovered that an investment he had written off as stable but uninspiring has begun, at last, to yield extraordinary returns. After dinner, when the Dowager had retired and the younger Linford girl was playing at the pianoforte in the music room, Josiah found Phoebe alone in the corridor outside the drawing room. She was adjusting a candle that had guttered in its sconce, always counting, always noticing, always tending to the small mechanics that kept a great house running. "He looks at you differently," her father said. "Yes." "What did you do?" Phoebe straightened the candle and turned to him. In the corridor light, her father's face was older than she remembered, the lines deeper, the hair thinner at the temples, but his eyes were the same, sharp and warm, and always calculating, always weighing the evidence. "I curtsied," she said. Her father waited, in the way that men who have negotiated 1,000 contracts learn to wait, not impatiently, but with the certainty that the silence itself will produce more information than any question. "At the opera, to Lady Avebury, in front of everyone." Josiah Linford stared at his daughter for a long moment. Then he laughed, a single, short bark of a laugh that contained in it more pride than any speech he had ever made. "By God," he said, "you are my daughter." "I have always been your daughter," Phoebe said. That was rather the point. Years later, they would sit in that same dining room with their daughter Elise between them, a girl of 8 who had inherited her father's gray eyes and her mother's talent for arithmetic, and who would grow up knowing that her mother had once silenced an entire opera house without making a sound. Elise would hear the story not from Phoebe, who never spoke of it, but from Mrs. Trask, who told it once on a winter evening when the child had asked why her father always stood when her mother entered a room. Because, Mrs. Trask had said, folding linens in the still room with the efficiency of a woman who had served one household for 20 years and intended to serve it for 20 more, your mother taught him something that most men never learn, that the quietest person in the room is very often the most dangerous, not because she will strike, but because she will simply stand there, being exactly who she is, until everyone else realizes that they are the ones who ought to be afraid. The opera house had gone on performing, of course. The soprano had finished her aria. The chandeliers had continued to burn. But something in the foyer of the King's Theater had changed that evening, a recalibration so subtle that only those who had witnessed it understood its magnitude. The Duchess of Strathmore had curtsied to her husband's mistress, and in doing so had revealed, with the devastating clarity of a woman who had spent 3 years reading ledgers and counting candles and saying nothing, that she had never been the one who was beneath anyone. Miles Langton would serve in the House of Lords for another 30 years, and he would be known for many things: his work on the Corn Laws, his speeches on harbor reform, his refusal to vote with his party when his conscience disagreed. But in the drawing rooms of London, where the real history of the ton was kept in the memories of women who forgot nothing, he would be known for something else: that he was the Duke who stood when his wife entered a room, and that he had learned to do so only after she had taught him, without ever raising her voice, that she had been standing all along. The stories find the people who need them. They arrive here, like a curtsy held with perfect stillness whenever they are ready.